Good day. This is Meditation Amsterdam once again with a little video about meditation, mindfulness, life coaching, and some such topics. In today's video, I want to talk about the thinking mind. This is a topic that I occasionally revisit because it's quite fundamental to understanding the work that we're trying to do when we do meditation. And the inspiration from this video comes from a coaching session that I had a couple of weeks ago with someone who wants to engage in a bit of a longer term life coaching engagement and who's clearly interested in a kind of real personal transformation as opposed to just looking for little meditative tactics or brain tricks to step out of stress or discomfort. So that's it's quite rewarding actually to work with people who are really curious in that way. And so because we had more time, or we have more time to work together, it means that I can go into a lot of detail about Buddhist topics or how the mind works and topics of this kind. So out of that, I thought I would do a quick video on this whole idea of the thinking brain and why it is so problematic and why thinking is not real intelligence, although we tend to confuse it for real intelligence. So it starts with the thinking process in the brain and the fundamental problem of when we identify ourselves with it. So if you take your mind to be this circle over here, there's a part of your mind that is dedicated to thinking. So it's going to be this part over here, and that part is has become very dominant in our brains. So it's always active, signified by the endless blah blah that it keeps emitting. And now we could go into the evolutionary reasons of why this is the case, and we can also go into the cultural reasons of why this is the case. So evolutionarily speaking, I can well imagine that a mind that could think more and project itself into future scenarios and imagine things and communicate things verbally was far more dominant than a mind that was impaired in those functions, so that the hominids that had higher thinking abilities became stronger, more dominant, and those thinking abilities and the dominance of that function got passed down into future generations. And then we find ourselves in modern society where thinking as a function has a primacy in our minds. So we tend to believe that thinking is true intelligence, and that the better you can think, the more intelligent you are. There is definitely some truth to that. However, because the thinking function in the brain has become so dominant, and we have given it such a limelight, such a front row seat in our psyche, something funny has happened, which is that both mentally and culturally we have come to completely confuse ourselves with the thinking function. In other words, this little thinking module in the brain here has gone rogue. I'm gonna make it red to illustrate the fact that it has sort of turned into like this parasitic function that has cloaked itself, and it pretends to be you. In other words, most people draw no distinction between their thoughts and their sense of self. Language has a lot to do with this as well. So that you would rarely find someone who thinks or operates by saying, there is a thought in my mind about X, Y, or Z. or I am entertaining a thought about whatever, or my brain seems to believe that X or Y is the case. What you say instead is, I think / believe, and so on and so forth. What that means is that the thinking or the believing, which are parts of this thinking function of the brain, have co-opted your sense of self. They are kind of an imposter if you're in your mind, if you will, or they are kind of like have a parasitic relationship in which what is normally just a function of the brain is standing as if he speaks for you, and it has co-opted your sense of self. And this is a very, very big problem, as a matter of fact, because your degrees of freedom are drastically reduced when this is the case. It's almost like you are in character. You can't step away from being in character. So now this can all be a little bit abstract, especially if you don't know what the alternatives are. And so, to put it very, very bluntly, as I did a couple of weeks ago when discussing with this client of mine, is to say, look, you have the thinking part of the brain, which is doing blah, right? So it's producing content. And we tend to think that this blah is intelligence, but really it's just a mechanism. It takes input, it creates memory, and then it thinks stuff out of that, and sometimes also speaks stuff out of that thinking. And we tend to think that this mechanism is intelligence, but real intelligence is the brain's, or rather the mind's, ability to know that this is happening and to illuminate this content and this input and this memory and this output, so that this entire mechanism becomes transparent. And so whatever in your mind, and I think it is conscious awareness, right, is able to know the content of the thinking mind, is the real intelligence behind it. And you want to, and that's, I illustrate that by illustrating an eye, right? So the all-seeing eye of the mind can illuminate the thinking content of the mind. And that all-seeing eye of the mind, the conscious awareness, that's real intelligence. And this is just a process that's happening. And so part of the meditative journey and the journey in understanding our own minds is in being able to observe thinking for what it is, which is just a process, eliminate. We want to eliminate the sense of self that derives from this, and move our sense of self away from the thinking process and begin identifying ourselves with a real self, which is us as conscious awareness, real intelligence, real sense of self. That's a very powerful move. While we are stuck in thinking as our identity, we are stuck with the limitations of the mechanics of thinking. So let's get into some of those, because I think that even though we are communicating right now with words and with thinking, I can make a logical appeal against this as a good place in which to reside, or in which to park your sense of self. So the thinking function is it is a tool. And as with any tool, it has limitations. It has a certain objective, which is it is directed towards what exactly? It wants to solve problems, right? It wants to imagine things, right? So the little light bulb, and it wants to potentially project itself in time to anticipate future events. So it does all these things in a very nice way. However, it sees the world in these terms. So it sees the world in past and future. It sees the world in terms of things, problems to be solved, things to acquire, things to get away from, and projecting in imaginary realities. So that if you confuse yourself with your thinking function, you start to see the world in those terms. That's a very, very big issue, because the world is not this. This is the world seen through the lens of the thinking function. And so what happens with these is that you are constantly caught in trying to acquire things, or being fearful, or being in conflict with things, because that's the other big one about the thinking mind, is that it sees the world. This, by the way, is a yin-yang sign. I'm going to try to draw it here as best as I can. It sees the world in terms of good and bad, me and the other. So it creates a separation immediately. And that separation is the source of our sense of lack of fulfillment and happiness, because love is the absence of perceived separation. And the thinking mind does the opposite of that. So that what we have confused in a sense is that we have taken a tool. Okay, so this is the thinking mind. It's a tool, right? We have taken a tool that is there to keep you alive, and we are trying to use it very often, or most often than not, as the same tool that will make us happy. And a tool that is meant for survival, it's mostly a weapon, actually, to create a sense of separation, individuality, solve problems. It's a weapon, is not meant to make you feel fulfilled or happy or connected to the greater whatever, right? Or to others, right? That's in essence, or in a nutshell, the big problem that we face in modern society, and that we face in our minds. And it's not, I mean, it has been aggravated or made worse by our modern culture. But if you look at yogic scriptures, I mean, this has been going on for thousands of years. The thinking mind has co-opted your sense of self, the sense of self for humans, for a very long time. And unplugging for it takes enormous effort, but it is very rewarding, because hijacking the primacy of thinking and moving towards perception as a more balanced approach to park our sense of self is what makes us fulfilled at the end of the day. So we don't have to go to extremes. We don't have to stop our thinking. In fact, we stand no chance of doing that. All that we need to do is to no longer confuse ourselves with the thinking tool in our mind, and to move towards a higher intelligence where observation and awareness is the center. And then something funny starts to happen, which is that opens the door for fulfillment to take place. I hope that is compelling enough to try to give that a go. Certainly makes logical sense to me, not to identify yourself or your sense of self with a tool, and not use a tool that is meant for survival and to keep you alive, and try to use that same tool, that same weapon, to make you feel complete, or to make you feel fulfilled or happy, because it's the wrong tool for the job. It doesn't know how to do that. It never will. It is useless to try to make the thinking mind the vehicle or the tool to do that. That was one of the approaches, for example, of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis, or sunny side of the street, the power of positive thinking or whatever, used to say, well, we have the thinking mind here, and we have some happy thoughts, and we have some nasty thoughts. And the idea is, every time we have a nasty thought, we try to find the sunny side of the street, or we try to minimize the number of nasty thoughts or whatever, and that'll get us to the promised land, so that the happy part of things starts to really take over. But the problem is that the very function of the mind is dual. It's happy and nasty. And because the thinking mind's job is to find problems in the future and to create a boundary between yourself and the other, it has to tap into the nastiness by definition. It's its job. And we're trying to hijack that task. Whereas in reality, all you need to do is to not believe that you are this, but to step out of it and to simply observe. I wanted to add something else to thinking as a limited function. And that is, it comes from a book of Richard Bandler and John Grinder, who were the guys who started the whole NLP discipline. And that is the limitations of thought and the way our minds work as reasons to have a healthy degree of skepticism and hold our own ideas very tentatively, right? And so these are the three big limitations or cognitive limitations that we face as humans, which cast doubt on pretty much every thought, or rather make every thought that we have a limited tool, as opposed to something that can take us ultimately to an end goal. One of them is that our mind suffers from generalizations. It generalizes. What generalizations mean is that it takes one bit of learning and it applies it to everything that looks similar later down the line. So that the classic example that I like to use is that once you learn how a doorknob works, you apply it to every future doorknob that you ever face. If your mind, this is a matter of economy. If your mind was not able to generalize from one doorknob to the next, every single doorknob that you came across would present you with the challenge of having to learn how to open it. Even if the color was slightly different or the shape was slightly different, you'd be at a loss on what to do. Now, so there's a big economical reason why your mind should generalize in the way it learns things. However, the price to pay is that it goes too far. So for the sake of efficiency and economy, it overgeneralizes most of the time. And that's when we run into trouble, because we start to approach things based on past experience. And it creates a big veil that limits the way we perceive reality. It's funny also how it runs into limitations, right? So there's a limit of how far that generalization can apply. Because if you come across an element that is very different from the generalized starting point, you need to learn all over again. I came across that very example of the doorknob or the door mechanism not too long ago, when I tried to step into my boss's new Tesla. So she drives a Tesla now, and the way the door opens is very, very different from your typical door. You need to know what to push and how to pull and the rest of it. So that's where the generalization mechanism found its limits, and so it's a bit annoying actually. Something to be said about things that break away from the standard a little bit too far. So generalization is one big limitation that should always keep you on your guard in believing your own thoughts too intensely, or believing that your thoughts are correct or entirely correct. The other one is omission. Omission. You'll have to excuse my spelling. I'm not sure if it's single M and double S, but to omit things in your perception. And omission is a mechanism that is dictated by what's called your reticular activation system. It is essentially, you only take in what you focus on. So you remember that your mind is always trying to solve problems and detect either goodies or threats in the environment. So your mind is going around looking, and it looks for stuff, and then out of all its constant scanning, it'll detect something in the environment that is a threat, or it'll detect something in the environment that is something desirable. I'm trying to think of maybe like this is an apple, right? So this is a desirable element in the environment. And once it has detected something that makes its radar sort of zero in, everything else is ignored. And therefore you are only ever perceiving a narrow amount of elements in your environment, and everything else is ignored. A great example to illustrate how omission takes place and how things suddenly catch your attention is what they call the cocktail party effect. You'll be in a party full of people, there's hundreds of conversations happening around you, but the instant that your name is mentioned somewhere, boom, your attention goes there immediately. Meaning the entire thing was being scanned, but only a couple of elements, such as your present conversation or your name out there, has enough of a spike in your reticular activation system to zero in. But the rest of the time, everything is kind of just being ignored for the most part. And so your thinking or your perception omits a lot of things, and therefore your thinking cannot possibly be as correct as you think it is. And the other one is distortions, to distort. Distort. And this has a lot to do with our ability to perceive correctly. Because we omit things, because we generalize things, what often tends to happen, or due to previous memory, or you name it, or simply lack of perceptive ability, is that when we perceive things, we perceive incorrectly. A great example of that I use a lot during my coaching sessions is around emotions, right? So we tend to think that an emotion is a thing, but as we often learn when we go into mindfulness work, is that an emotion is made up of a thinking component and a somatic component. And these two, they weave into a kind of fabric that makes them seem as if they are a single thing, and therefore they become intractable, very difficult to deal with, sometimes overwhelming. But there is a term in Hindu or rather yogic philosophy called viveka, which stands for clarity of perception, which starts to disentangle things in a way that we can then deal with them a lot more easy. So the mind generalizes, the mind distorts, the mind omits, and therefore the thoughts that come out of it cannot possibly be entirely correct. They have limits, and those limits are what make every argument have a counter argument, and it makes it so that if you fall in love with your own ideas, if you become opinionated, or if you are opinionated, you're kind of stuck. And it's I couldn't find who wrote the quote, but there's a quote that says that a thought is not owned by the mind, but it's something that owns the mind. In other words, you have your sense of self here, and you have your thinking here, and your gravitas, or your center, your mental center, can be co-opted by the thought if you cling to it, and you are really determined, and you invest this with a sense of self. So your gravitas is here, and so you've given this your sense of self, and then your real center, which is the observer, is divested from a sense of self. So and that's what happens when your thinking is taken too seriously. When you truly believe in what you think, and you truly believe that you are the thinker, then your entire center of gravity revolves around this as opposed to this. And so part of today's talk was to start to understand the limitations of the thinking mind as a tool, start to understand the limitations of the mind as a process that has all kinds of distortions, omissions, so that you can find it a little bit easier to disentangle from believing your thoughts other than holding them very tentatively, and also to start to disentangle your sense of self away from the thinking function of the mind, and to start to try and find the observer, which is what mindfulness and meditation can help you to achieve. So I hope that is a helpful video. I'll be back with more as usual, and cheerio. Bye.